Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank the Academy for the fellowship and for the opportunity to present some of our work here. Also, I would like to thank the organizers, Prof. Vinod Singh and team, particularly the student volunteers who have been working really hard for making everything so wonderful and nice here. Today, I'm going to talk about one specific aspect of what we have been working on, namely ultra-thin single crystalline gold nanowires. I will go and define what I mean by each of these terms. I should also point out that I have sacrificed a little bit of rigor or details in the interest of the general audience that we have here. I will try to, if I am able to convey the excitement that we have to most of you, then I think I would have my job done. I will acknowledge my students and collaborators who have been wonderful collaborators and really even more wonderful students that I have had here who have been working on various aspects of the projects that I am talking about, facilities and also funding from DST in particular. In our group, basically we have been working on a variety of things. Wet chemical synthesis is the primary thing. We make nanostructures of various kinds. Of course, I am not going to talk about all of this. I am going to talk about one specific aspect. We have been working on porous structures and more recently a lot on nanoscale hybrids for various kinds of applications including catalysis. But today what I am going to do is to talk about one specific aspect, namely ultra-thin single crystalline gold nanowires. I just want to tell you, define each of these terms that I have here and tell you why it is exciting and why it is new and interesting. For example, I will specifically talk about the mechanisms of how these wires grow, the structure in some detail and little bit about properties and applications depending upon the time. I had this thing, the term intriguing in this title. I should define what and why this is intriguing. First of all, what do you mean by ultra thin? I think all of you recognize this structure here. If you look at the dimensions here, it is of the order of 2 nanometers. The gold nanowires that we have been able to make in the lab without any template is of similar dimensions. These are 2 nanometers or slightly below 2 nanometers in diameter. If you think about it, these are about 5 to 6 atoms thick. So these are really thin wires that we have been able to make using a fairly simple method. And of course, these are fairly long, 2 microns long, which means that the aspect ratio is more than 1000. And this is a very simple method where we can make it. The second term, namely single crystalline. What do you mean by single crystalline? We know, all of us know that crystalline material, we have translational periodicity and so on. This is, if you extend this in all possible directions, we have no extended defects of any kind. This is what we call as a single crystal. On the other hand, you could actually think of material having domains which are ordered and which are actually separated by what are called as high angle boundaries. What we have are really single crystalline wires, which means that there are no extended defects of any kind. How do we go about making this thing and what makes this whole thing intriguing? Okay, so let me define what I mean by wet chemical synthesis. For the experts in the audience, kindly go to standby mode so that you can conserve power. But this is primarily for a primer sort of thing on wet chemical synthesis. Let's take an example of gold, the material that I am talking about. We would start out with a metal in the non-zero oxidation state, namely something like gold in +3 oxidation state, and something that can provide electrons to reduce it, so that we get reduced metal. Of course, the metal atoms then in the solution phase come together to form small clusters which will then grow. This is the standard process of what is called as nucleation and growth. Okay. We have another ingredient here which is called as a capping agent. The primary purpose of the capping agent is to basically go and attach itself or adsorb on the surface of the growing crystal. That is what basically defines your size and shape of the crystal that you are going to have. This absorption, this is actually the capping agent is an absorption-desorption equilibrium. It is not a static sort of situation. And therefore, with a small change in reaction conditions and the ratios of these reagents, you can actually get a very large variety of sizes and shapes. Okay, so this is what primarily wet chemical synthesis of a simple metal looks like. The interesting thing is that during the early stages of nucleation, that is when the crystal initially forms, there are 2 energy terms that are involved, one which is a barrier term and the volume free energy term, which basically drives the formation of the crystal. The barrier term, namely that you are actually creating new surfaces, means that the crystal would like to form or adopt a shape that has a minimum surface energy or the interfacial energy in the growing medium. we know that for a liquid, of course, this will be like a spherical thing, because a liquid is isotropic and there are no preference for any specific direction, whereas a crystal is anisotropic, which means that the bond density, if you think about it, is different along different directions. And therefore, the equilibrium shape, the so-called equilibrium shape of crystal is one that minimizes the surface energy for a given volume of the crystal, and typically for a face-centered cubic material, this is something like this is called a cuboctahedral shape. Okay. So, the further growth basically happens by attachment of atoms to this particular nucleus that forms. The interesting or the intriguing thing is that starting from this equilibrium shape, we can identify two classes of shapes that can actually form. One, what I call as the symmetry conserving shapes, which is nominally consistent with the point group symmetry, and symmetry breaking shapes. I am going to explain this in some more detail. For those of you who are interested, we had a review on this particular topic. Okay. So, why gold and what is interesting or different about gold when we make it in the nano form? I am going to state several facts that we know or we think we know about gold, and show you that when we make them in the nano form or nanowire form, as I am going to talk about, most of these things basically break down. What we thought we knew no longer is true. Okay. Gold is a high symmetry material, cubic material, and therefore will not grow as a wire. What do I mean by that? When we think about how a crystal forms, this is the famous example of how a snowflake forms. Okay. And Kepler long ago recognized that the external symmetry or the form of the snowflake that we have is somehow related to the internal building block that we have. For example, all the snowflakes, even though they may have different, nominally different looking shapes, they all have this internal hexagonal symmetry. Okay. I think I had a video, but in the interest of time I will skip that. So, when we have a cubic crystal, for example, in which the building block is something like this, there is no unique direction along which the crystal will like to grow, and therefore, there is no reason that this cubic crystal will like to or will grow as a wire. Whereas on the other hand, when you have something like an orthorhombic crystal or a tetragonal crystal even or a hexagonal crystal, there is a unique direction along which the crystal can grow faster, for example, then end up as a wire. So, how do we actually end up with a wire with a cubic structure? There has to be some kind of symmetry breaking, which basically decides that one direction has to grow at the expense of all these symmetry equivalent directions. So, what is the mechanism for this symmetry breaking? Okay. So, we came up with this actually method. By the way, we were actually the first group to grow these such thin wires without a template. This was published quite some time back in 2007. The basic method or the basic mechanism is as follows. As I told you, we start off by making gold nanoparticles. In this case, this is the shape that it adopts, as I told you, and this is actually bound by the amine, which is a surfactant in this particular case. It turns out that the amine, the surfactant, binds very differently to the square facets as I have shown here and the hexagonal facets, which means that I can selectively, in some sense, selectively remove the binding from the hexagonal facet. And when that happens, what would happen is, to minimize the surface energy, two particles would like to come and attach in this particular fashion. This I call as a dimerization. This dimerization actually is the first step for the symmetry breaking that happens. I will explain in more detail what happens. So, this is our starting state where we have very fine particles, and in transmission electron microscope, if you look at these rightly oriented particles, we can actually see that they have this shape. Okay. And after the so called oriented attachment happens, we end up with these very long thin single crystalline wires, as is evident from the high resolution image. What is happening here and what is the symmetry breaking? We know that when two particles come and coalesce in this particular fashion, we will have mass transport. For example, two liquid droplets you can visualize, they will actually come together, mass will go from the convex region to the concave region, and they will actually form a smoothing process that will happen. Similar thing happens in solids also. Okay. I mean, if you have such two particles come and attach in this fashion, they will undergo what is called a sintering at room temperature, and therefore, all the 111 facets of the hexagonal facets on the sides are now gone. We only have the two ends which have where the new particle can come and attach. Therefore, this dimerization process or this smoothing process basically gives you a symmetry which is along this particular axis, and that is what actually drives the formation of the wire. Of course, the time scales are they work out fine, and we have actually calculated that. Never mind the details. That is one intriguing thing, that we are able to actually grow a single crystalline wire from a high symmetry material by this mechanism. The second thing, gold has an Fcc structure. We all know what a simple face-centered cubic structure is, but when we go to the nano scale, we know that the fraction of surface atoms is significantly larger as compared to the atoms that are in the interior. And what is the difference? We know that atoms are very social creatures, which means that an atom in the interior is surrounded by a certain number of neighbors, whereas on the surface they do not have as many neighbors because the top side of the crystal is free, there is no atoms there, and therefore these atoms you can think of them as unhappy, and because they have excess energy. This is what we term as surface energy. Because of this excess surface energy, and if a large fraction of these atoms are residing on the surface, they will undergo some kind of relaxation. Okay, either the atoms will like to come together or move apart, do something so that they can minimize this kind of a difference. And this really leads to the definition of surface stress is slightly more detailed, but I am not going to talk about that, but that basically leads to some kind of a reconstruction. In literature, it is very well known that you can actually get in very, very small particles, we can get changes in lattice parameter. Lattice parameter is what characterizes the spacing between the atoms in the unit cell, for example. Because of this relaxation, the whole crystal as a entity can either expand or contract, and we can actually measure this difference in lattice parameter. What we wanted to do is to look at what the structure or the relaxed structure of these such kind of wires are, because as I told you, these are only 5 atoms or 6 atoms thick. So there must be some dramatic relaxation that happens here. So Umesh talked about the use of density functional theory for looking at the relaxed structure of different crystals and so on. We use a combination of density functional theory and modern electron microscopy, which is actually really powerful to look at the kinds of displacement that are actually predicted by DFT. And then I'll tell you the story first, and then I'll go through the details quickly. What we actually found is that we know that in an atom or in a crystal, planes are planar. That's why they're called planes. Whereas when you have a wire, what basically happens is the wires that are the planes that are actually normal to the wire direction now become like saddle shaped. They are actually undergo wrinkling because of this kind of relaxation. So to put it in a form, this is the starting state where we have ABC stacking of the gold in the gold nanowire, whereas after relaxation we see that atoms have significantly moved up and down the plane. And to put it in a cartoon form, this basically form like saddles. They have positive and negative curvature. The good thing about the modern day electron microscope is that we can actually look at individual atomic columns and look at how they displace from their actual positions. Okay, so what we have been able to do, this is the kind of displacement that we are talking about. These are the order of several tens of or a few tens of picometers. What we have been able to do is actually to minimize effects from the substrate on the positions of the atoms. We have put it on a substrate which is very well defined, so that we can subtract out the contribution by some kind of Fourier filtering. That's basically a graphene substrate. We drop these wires or grow these wires on graphene and look at it in the electron microscope. And we do actually find that we can actually see the kinds of displacements that is predicted by theory in these wires. So this is a new and different kind of relaxation that has not been predicted or observed in these kinds of nanostructures before. So that is a new and different thing. So I will not go to the details. So I will want to go to the next part, namely the third fact which is very well known is that gold is a very good metal, extremely good thermal conductor and electrical conductor, and therefore possibly it can be used as interconnects, and of course there are other details, but it's a very good conductor. So how do we actually probe? Why this is interesting from a physics point of view is that this represents a really small system through which we can actually study electrical transport, and we expect some very interesting or new things could happen. Okay, people are interested in transport through nanowires. The extreme case is one where you can think we can take a metal and then pull it. So just before it breaks, it forms what is called as a single atomic chain junction, which is of the order of few 3 or 4 atoms, which is very transient. Okay, and on the other extreme we have wires which are of the order of tens of nanometers and which are polycrystalline, which means that which have high angle boundaries. There is no good system actually to study electrical transport in some really small systems. What we have is a fairly stable system which is which can be in the solution phase, which can store for a long time and possibly make electrical contacts and do transport studies. Okay, so but if you think about it, the standard lithography procedures that we would use would mean that you would actually see the wires and then make contacts. It's extremely difficult in this case. Even for things of the order of 100 nanometers, we know that lithography and site specific contacts are not easy. So what we did is inverted the problem, namely we actually make the contacts first and then grow the wires between the contact pads. We can do this because we know that it happens by particle-particle attachment, as I explained, and therefore the gold clusters can actually attach to this contact pad and then grow, and nominally, of course, since there is another pad which is closed, it can basically span across these things. So what we have been able to do is to actually grow these wires across the contact pads and do different kinds of 2 probe as well as 4 probe and do transport measurements. Interestingly, what we find, again there is a lot of physics here which I am going to skip. If anybody is interested, we can talk about it later. What I am plotting here is a resistance versus temperature. If you think for a metal, you would think that the resistance would increase as you increase the temperature because of the scattering process that increase in temperature. On the other hand, what we are seeing here is R normalized to the room temperature resistance basically decreasing. So, there is something new and interesting going on here, and we get some very interesting scaling behavior that basically tells you that there is a breakdown of the standard description that we have for these kinds of metal wires. And the last part, maybe just a couple of slides, and gold is a noble metal and we do not expect it to be good for any catalysis. Of course, there is the so called Haruta catalyst, very small clusters of gold are used for carbon monoxide oxidation and so on. So, these are actually in the right size to do some kind of catalysis. In addition, we also have a path for electron transport. So, there are some interesting things that could happen, but to do any of that, we need to be able to put these wires on different substrates or attach them to different substrates. And so, we have been actually working on making different kinds of heterostructures using these single crystalline gold nanowires. One of the interesting things that is more recent that we have been able to do is to actually put them on for something like zinc oxide, for example. Okay. And this is an interesting system because if you shine light on zinc oxide, we get these electron hole pairs, and the electrons can be actually transferred to the gold wires because of the suitable alignment of your energy bands, and that actually leads to very interesting enhanced photoelectrooxidation, for example, ethanol in this particular case. Okay. So, what I have been able to show you, hopefully, an overview that single crystal gold nanowires are very interesting and conventional wisdom fails. More recently, we have been able to make alloy nanowires, and therefore, as you can see, the complexity or the interesting detail that we can actually study increases manifold in this case. Thank you for your attention.